like James, a developer evangelist at Xamarin. Today I'm here to talk about an app that I built about half a day. So it took just as long to build as probably this talk will take. So it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out, but wish me luck. So I assume everyone here is a .NET developer? Fantastic. Has everyone attended Alex's session earlier? So he had intro to Xamarin. Is there anyone in the room that doesn't know basically what Xamarin is? Don't be shy, because I'm happy to spend 30 seconds to just... Perfect. So you don't know? Okay, so Xamarin is a technology that allows you to run C# or F# across iOS, Android, and the Mac. So who here has heard of Mono? So the people who didn't know what Xamarin was didn't know what Mono was. So Mono is a re-implementation of .NET and the core CLR and all of the lovely bits that allow us to take our C# and run that on Windows and Windows Phone. But it allows us to target Linux, Mac, and now mobile devices. So it allows you to write your code once in C#, but we can run it everywhere. Now the key thing about Xamarin is that in terms of the UI that you're using, it's a native user interface. So it's a one-to-one binding to the platform APIs. So on iOS, when we want to have a button, it will be a UI button. When we want a table view, it's going to be a UI table view controller. So there's nothing that the Objective-C or Swift guys can create that we can't create in Xamarin using C#. I've got some slides and things that can talk about Xamarin in detail, which I'm happy to share with you afterwards. But this session is going to be mostly looking at some code and talking about the process in which I use to develop the step counting app. We're going to talk a little bit about Azure, and depending on how much time we've got at the end of the session, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of something I'm working on, which is a C# iOS app. We're going to bring it to Android, and we're going to make a UWP version, but it's got a .NET C# Azure backend. So today we're mostly going to be talking about the pedometer app, my step counter, and how I was asked to tweak it for the Ignite conference and how I went about doing that. So I'm a developer evangelist for Xamarin, and it's my job to travel normally Europe and give presentations about how you can take your existing C# skills and transfer that to some new platforms. And I've got a couple of apps that I've built using Xamarin. So we've got beer drinking, which is on GitHub right now. It's not in the app stores. This is the app that we may come around to talk to a little later. So iOS, it's got an Azure backend. It's pretty nice. Has anyone used Untapped? A couple of you. So that's a Cordova app. It's for tracking how many beers you drink and writing reviews and taking photos. Now, because it's Cordova, it's a hybrid app. And I don't want any hybrid apps installed on my phone, so I thought there's got to be a better way. And it turns out I just had to reinvent the wheel. So I'm building an Untapped competitor entirely with Xamarin with a C# backend. So Step Counter is an app that I built on Boxing Day 2013. I wanted to build an app in a day, and I set myself a simple task of a step counter, pedometer app, to count how many steps I've taken, because the new iPhone, the 5S at the time, had got a new API within Core Motion to allow me to query how many steps I'd taken. I also built an app called Dutch Spelling. So my best friend moved from London back to Belgium, because he's a Belgian, to be closer to his family. And I started to miss him, and I didn't want to grow old without saying that I've lived outside of the UK at some point in my life. So I decided I'm going to move to Belgium to be closer to my friend, and I didn't want to move to a foreign country without speaking the language. So I got myself a tutor, a Dutch tutor, and for 6 months, twice a week, we'd sit down for an hour, and I would learn Dutch. And to make my learning even better, I decided I'd build an app to help me learn Dutch spelling. So I built it. It's very nice. It's open source. It's not in the App Store, but if anyone wants to publish it, it's all there. It's ready to go if you want to. So I built the app. I moved to Belgium, but I ended up living in a French-speaking region. So those 6 months and the app was slightly useless, but ik spreek een klein beetje Nederlands, so it's not entirely useless. But these are all built using C#. And it's my favorite language. So I've always been a cross-platform developer. So before I worked for Xamarin, I worked on a company that built architectural lighting control systems. So these were built using Qt or Qt. Has anyone used Qt or Qt? So it's C++. It's a nice C++ framework. And these were embedded controllers, and we had a Mac client and a Windows client, and these were used to control things like the London Eye and numerous other large lighting installations around the world. Now, when we released the product, the LPC, or the lighting processor, you could control it through RS-235, RS-232, you could have Ethernet commands, you could do MIDI, you could do digital I/O, and it was great. Everyone loved it, and this was like 2006. Mobile wasn't a huge thing as it is right now, and it was hugely popular. It's bolted up. 2 of them are bolted on the side of the London Eye. It's been spinning for almost a decade now. But the engineers at the London Eye, in order to control the lights, would have to go and touch a horrible Windows 98 PC. They have to go into a separate room and log in with their login credentials. And they called me up and they said, Mike, I want to be able to control the lights on the London Eye from my iPhone and iPad. We thought, well, that sounds like a reasonable request. Who wouldn't want to be able to control the lights on that from their iPhone? So I was given the task of creating a mobile application to control this. And the lighting controller had a built-in web server. So I went with the easiest approach. I'd never built an application before for mobile, so I went with the web approach. I built a hybrid app. I used jQuery Mobile. In the proof of concept, I went through a couple of technologies. I used JQ Touch. Does anyone use JQ Touch? One. The guy that built JQ Touch was hired by Senture Touch. So has anyone used Senture Touch? No one. Well, Senture Touch is a reasonable web hybrid approach to developing applications. It's got very nice CSS, but it didn't fit for me. I didn't enjoy developing it. I found jQuery Mobile to be the best of the approaches. So I built the app using jQuery Mobile, and we shipped it to the engineers on site so they could sit there with their iPads. And they came back and they said, Mike, it looks how we wanted, but it doesn't feel right. And I completely understood what they meant. So when we were transitioning from view A to view B, it would flash through white. When you would launch it from the home screen, from the launch screen, and pretend it was a normal app, it behaved differently to how it would behave when you had the navigation bar and were running it as a proper website. So it's a pretty horrible experience for the engineers on site. And the worst bit was I hated every single moment of developing this application. I'm not a huge fan of JavaScript. It's a means to an end. I'll do it to get web stuff working for a website. If I'm developing an app, I want to use a real language. I want to be using the IDE, that's my favorite IDE, which is Visual Studio. I don't want to be in a text editor. So they came to me and they said, Mike, we want to add a color picker to this. We want to be able to select colors live. I thought, well, that's a reasonable request. Who wouldn't want to be able to live control the lights of the London Eye from their iPhone? And then it dawned on me that I'm going to have to write this in JavaScript with some CSS3 and some HTML5. And I was like, no, don't want to do it. And this was on a Friday. And I knew that I had 2 options over the weekend. I could go into work and hand in my resignation and say, I'm done. I just cannot write any more JavaScript for you. I'm going to go and find a new job. Or I could go into work with an alternative solution. So I looked on that Friday evening for an alternative solution. And I really wanted to use .NET and C#. So I typed into Google C# on iPhone. And Xamarin popped up as the first hit. And at the time, there were no free trials. There was no free version of Xamarin. It was just you pay, you get it, you build your app, you're good to go. So I pulled out my credit card, and I bought a license to Xamarin iOS. And over the 48 hours, I hacked, and it was a real hack, together a Xamarin iOS app, 100% native, that used all of the native APIs for iOS. And I went into work on the Monday morning, and I showed my boss. I said, hey, Simon, look at this app that I've built. And he looked at it, and he said, is this native? I said, yes, it is. He said, Mike, we're a cross-platform house. This app is useless. We can't use this. It's like, Simon, we can share at least 75% of this app code to Android and Windows Phone if we want. It's cross-platform, but it's still native. And I was Wonder Boy for a whole week. I blew his mind. And I stayed there for about a week, and then I started contracting for Xamarin. So I wasn't Wonder Boy after that. But that's how I got started with Xamarin and cross-platform. I fell in love with the technology. But today we're here to talk about my step counter, which is this pedometer app that I built for iOS and my colleague James Montemagno built for Android. So some interesting facts about step counter. It's built entirely in C#. So although we say this is a cross-platform app, because it's using C#, it's using Mono, so it's using .NET as we know and love, there isn't a huge amount of code that we're able to share across the platforms. Because this is the one-to-one mapping to every single API, and it's calling into sensor hardware of the device. So as a cross-platform talk, it's a little weak. But Microsoft got in touch with me, and they said, do you want to fly out to Australia? And I said, yes, I do. Absolutely. It's pretty cold in London right now, and I'm topping up my tan. So I was like, yes, I'd love to. And they said, can you come and talk about step counter? I was like, ooh, of all the apps to choose. But sure thing, I'll come and talk. So they said to me, can you add a .NET Azure backend? We want to be able to track how many steps people are taking. I was like, sure, I can do that. That's not very difficult. I was like, are you sure you want step counter of all? And yep, we want step counter, so here it is. So for iOS, there's some key bits of information. You have to have an iPhone 5 or above. Does anyone in the room have an iPhone 5 or above? So you all need to go onto the App Store now and download my step counter. And I'll show you why a little later. The download count in Australia is really, really low. So let's fix this today. It was built in half a day. This was Boxing Day for me. You guys have Boxing Day over here? Yeah? Oh, I love Australia. You even share the same queen. What's not to love? Good old Auntie Liz. So it was built in half a day. I was spending Christmas holiday with my parents, and I didn't want to be social. I wanted to just code. I wanted a bit of mic time to go and code. I had an iPhone 4 at the time. I was like, I've got to go and buy a new iPhone. It's my Christmas treat to myself. So I went to the Apple Store. I bought the iPhone 5S. And I got home, and I went and sat in my parents' office. And I started developing this app. It's had almost 35,000 unique downloads just on iOS alone, which is a pretty reasonable download count considering this was a sample app that I built for Xamarin in such a short amount of time, and we've not marketed it. It has 43,000 active sessions, and now most of these sessions actually come from one user. 16,000 sessions are from one person who seems to check their step count almost every 20 minutes. So obviously very active. But we have just over 1,000 regular users. So you can see that it's not the most exciting app, so people tend to download it, launch it, and then never open it again, which is pretty common on mobile apps, that people download it and then they bail. They say, no, I'm out. On Android, you're going to need 4.4, which is KitKat, and you're going to need a device that actually supports the step counting functionality. So it's not good enough just to say that I'm running 4.4 or above. Because Android is a beautiful disaster of an operating system. Is anyone here an Android user? Wow. So you can get onto the Google Play Store and you can download the app. It's been downloaded between 1,000 and 5,000 times. So let's crank that up. I will say now that most devices that are shipped of late do have this hardware functionality. But back when we developed this, which was I developed the iOS version in 2013. James developed the Android version in 2014. His was the only device that actually supported this functionality. So it's no wonder that the Android download count is so low. And it's all open source to the point where you literally can rebadge it and throw it into the App Store. And I found out last week that's exactly what someone's done with the Android version. They've removed both my names and James's name from the About page They haven't even updated the logo, but they shipped it onto the Google Play Store and they're getting downloads. So good for them. So let's talk about building the iOS app. So here I am on Boxing Day, developing with my comfy slippers. It's very cold in Britain around this time. So I always start my iOS apps by developing or designing the icon. So a lot of developers take the other approach of they'll develop the app, and then they'll come around to the artwork, so the splash screens and the icon. And what I tend to find is in the excitement of saying, well, we've got the app finished, let's ship it, you end up creating a pretty subpar icon. And that's the first thing that users are going to rate you on when they're looking through the hundreds of competitors that you might have. So I always like to just have a draft of an icon ready to go from the very get-go. And it also helps me define the color schemes for the entire app and makes me think about the user experience as a whole rather than just jumping straight into code. So that's a pro tip for you that I highly recommend. Start with the artwork first, then go and add some functionality and features. So I started designing the icon, and once I'd got some artwork that I was pretty happy with and some splash screen images, which are naturally now updated to storyboards and zibs for the auto layout goodness, I then needed to know, how do I actually get the step count on iOS? So I went over to the Apple website to find their documentation, and I started reading about CM step counter. Now CM stands for core motion. So because with Xamarin we've got this one-to-one binding to every API available to the Objective-C and Swift developers, there's no reason why I couldn't use these APIs in C# using Visual Studio. Now I should note that these APIs have been deprecated, so I definitely need to go back in. As you can see here, it was deprecated in iOS 8, so I do need to go and update this to use the new APIs, which is a pedometer API. But I want to have a look at the project. So let's take a look in an IDE, because I don't want to spend too long in slides. There we go. I love sharing keys. It's one of my favorite things. So nobody tweet that. So this is Xamarin Studio. This is our IDE. It's for Mac. Is anyone using Xamarin Studio as a day-to-day runner? Yeah? So the rest of you are Visual Studio guys? Awesome. We will be doing some Visual Studio stuff later for the Azure side of things. When I'm at home, I develop exclusively in Visual Studio. But let me explain why I'm showing you Xamarin Studio. When I'm at home, I've got my Surface Pro in the dock, set up to my multi-screens. It's wonderful. I control the network myself. I have all the ports open that I need. Everything works like a dream. But to develop for iOS with Xamarin, you need a Mac somewhere on the network because you're using their tool chain. You know, when you hit build in Visual Studio, your IL is shipped off to the Mac. It's converted to a bytecode that we can feed through the LMVM compiler. Now that's the same compiler that Objective-C and Swift apps use. So you have to have that Mac somewhere on the network. Now when I come around to conferences, I don't control the network. It's often the case that I'll turn up with my Surface, I'll be like, right, let's plug in the screen here, and I'll connect to the Mac, and I'll hide it away so that no one knows I've got a Mac. And then I find out that they've isolated the network, so I can't communicate. So what I like to do is demo on the Mac, and sometimes I'll use a virtual machine, so I use VMware, in order to communicate to the Mac underneath. So there are a couple of options, but as a general rule, at home, Visual Studio guy, I love it. I can't program without ReSharper. It saves my life. It makes my boss think that I'm an okay developer. Anyway. So let's have a look at the iOS app. First of all, let's actually see it running to see what we're dealing with. Here we go. There's my chest. We're going to share my iPhone screen. So the reason I'm sharing my iPhone screen rather than just deploying to the standard Apple simulator is this core motion functionality won't work in the simulator. There are some APIs that Apple are like, you've got to have a real device. HomeKit is just another example. You can't do HomeKit development in the simulator. You're going to need a physical device. And it kind of makes sense. You can't really count the steps in the simulator because your Mac isn't walking around anywhere, whereas your phone is. So here we go. We'll launch the application. And that's the icon I designed. Took me a while. And then we reset. We've got a nice little animation. And we change the color of that progress bar depending on where you're at. So the more steps we take, the closer to green it gets. And I've got some parallax on there, and it's really obvious on the projector. But on the device, it just looks like you've got some depth, some added depth to everything, which is pretty nice. Let's very quickly turn that on. And I implemented a feature where we can swipe down to reset. Now, this swipe down to reset is a really interesting feature because what I found was I implemented it and I shipped it as just a point update to the app. I was like, well, I've got to add insights to this app. Let's have it that you can swipe down to reset the step count because that's what people in the App Store were asking for. I never explained it to any of the users. I never said what this new feature was. And what I found is that people would swipe down, it'd get reset, and then they would close the app and never launch it again. So this is a pretty terrible bit of UX. So I highly recommend you avoid doing anything like this. But to get back to where you need to be, you just swipe up and boom, you're good to go. And I can sit here and I can shake the phone. And it's going to think I'm stepping around and walking about, and it will update. Now it's interesting because with core motion, when you're asking iOS to give you updates about how many steps you've taken, you would think that it would give you an event for every single step. So an event, an event, an event, an event. But it doesn't work like that. With iOS, it kind of groups them together. So it'll say kind of, you've taken an extra 10 steps here, we'll raise an event. You've taken 20 steps, we'll raise an event. So I expected it to be really nice and smooth, but it doesn't quite work like that. So let's actually have a look at some of the code for this. So most of the magic for iOS happens within this step manager class that I created. So standard .NET developers who've never done any iOS development are probably looking at some of these types and wondering what they are. So we've got NS operation queue, we've got CM step counter, and you're like, well, what are these things? These are iOS-specific APIs. So this class is a class that I cannot share to any other platform other than iOS. So what I do is I've got this step counter object, which is of type core motion step counter, and I'm asking it to give me updates for when I have some step events. And I'm saying that my update handler, so this is the code I'm going to call when I've actually raised the event. I've got some steps. Let's go ahead and call the updater. And the updater simply takes a nint. Is anyone familiar with nint? Who's not familiar with nint? And the rest of you who didn't raise your hands are being shy. At no point will I drag you up on stage and embarrass you, so there's no reason to be shy. So nint is how we do 64-bit with iOS. So there's no easy way to assume what size the integers are and the floats are between a 32-bit and 64-bit on iOS. So we created this nint, which kind of maps to, depending on the architecture that you're currently running your app on. So I can't just have an int here, because on the 64-bit iOS, just wouldn't work. So we have this nint to kind of hide the complexities for you. We didn't want to have to create nint, but it does solve the problem of going 64-bit. And that's really key, because all iOS apps today that you ship onto the App Store have to have 64-bit support. You can't just ship a 32-bit binary. So again, this code is unique to iOS, so there's not a lot of code sharing here. But anyway, we've got an NSDate, which is a bit like a date time. And in fact, I've got a helper that allows me to pass in date time, and then I'm just going to return, here we go. I pass in a date time, and And then I just return an NF date so that I don't have to create that in the iOS class. I can just have some helper files. And I'm saying we want to ask iOS to give me the step count for every update from midnight. Now, when we swipe down, we just save the date time of when did we swipe down, and that's going to be our new count for when we're tracking from. And when we swipe up, we're always going to go back to midnight. Now, I learned the hard way with this app that date times are really, really horrible. So different time zones react differently. And what I found was people in Florida always had about 2,000 extra steps from the day before because of a date time issue that I wasn't checking for. So there's always some fun with date time. I'm going to show you the storyboard. As I said, this is a super, super simple application, but it's actually doing some nice little things that demo what Xamarin can do. So here we've got our storyboard designer, which looks exactly the same within Visual Studio. So I'm sure you showed this off in earlier sessions. Yeah?
Not the actual designer, no.
So this is new. This is exciting. So has anyone done any Objective-C or Swift development? A couple of you. So in Objective-C and Swift, when you're using Xcode, you drag a button onto your view, and when you double-click on that button, what do we all expect that to do? The click event, right? Well, in Xcode, you double-click the button, and you can set the text for the button. No amount of double-clicking that button will get you to the click event. What you need to do is you need to click in 2 circles, which are in the top right-hand side of the toolbar, and that's going to bring up a split pane. It doesn't even tell you that that's a split pane, you just have to know. So you click those buttons, and it can take you a while to find them if you're just randomly clicking around. So you've got the split pane. You need to bring up the header file for the current view controller that you've got selected. Naturally, header files, gotta love it. You're then going to control-click on the button, and you're going to draw a blue line over to the header file, and you're going to drop the blue line, and it's going to say, hey, is this an action or an outlet? And every .NET developer in the world will go, what the hell is an action or an outlet? You'll work out eventually, with a bit of Googling, that what you want is an action, which is a touch-up inside event. But we were watching Xamarin developers going through this process of drawing endless blue lines in Xcode to create their UIs, and we're like, this is mad. There has to be a better way. And just like with beer drinking, there was a better way. We just had to build our own. So that's exactly what we did. We built an entire UI designer which uses the same format as Apple. So this is just a storyboard. I can just as easily open this in Xcode. In fact, why don't we do that? So I'll launch this into Xcode. Dun, dun, dun. We won't reopen. And here we go. Here is my view. And you're probably wondering, why does it look different? So this is why I love the Xamarin iOS designer. That background view, this gradient is a custom view that I created. And I've overridden the draw method in order to draw that gradient. And we're live rendering the control within the UI designer. So with Xamarin, we can create custom controls and see exactly how they look without having to deploy to the device or the simulator. And this is really fun when you start using tools like paint code. And with paint code, we can use a vector drawing package. So we can draw boxes and circles and create really beautiful controls. Let's see. Gotta love Mac. Nope, definitely haven't. Perfect. We won't go through that, but with paint code, we can literally drag and drop controls around. We can copy and paste from other vector drawing packages, and it's going to generate the C# drawing code for us. So then we just copy and paste that into our overridden draw method, and we'll live see it within the iOS designer on Visual Studio or the Mac. And let's actually have a look here. We can see my custom control, which is a background view. And if we come into my views, here we go. So I'm registering this as a background view. I'm saying this is design time visible. I want to be able to see this within our iOS designer. And then all I do is override the draw method. And I could do this for any control. In this case, I'm inheriting from UI view, because that's what most controls on iOS are going to inherit from. And then I just go ahead and set up the drawing code for this gradient. And this is all code generated by paint code. Now, when I show you beer drinking a little later, a lot of the controls there, and even the icon, I've got created as pure C#, so I can scale that to any size device. And this is a really fun thing. With an image-based control, if I go and run that on an iPad, it's going to look pixelated. Whereas with this, it's all resolution independent because it's just drawing on the device. So it's a really, really nice way to design your UI to look beautiful across every single device that you're running on. So the rest of it, we've got our control toolbox. So we've got every single control that the Objective-C and Swift guys have got access to. We can drag and drop. We can set properties for things. And just like in .NET, we can go ahead and set the name, which you can see up here. We set the name of the control. And then if we want this to be a custom control, we've overridden some properties. We've inherited from UI button. We can then go ahead and just select in a class. I want to use my UI button rather than the default UI button, which is pretty nice. The important bit is when I double click it, we go straight to the click event, which is what you expect. Now, if the click event doesn't exist, we'll just go ahead and create it for you. So that's super, super nice. But because this is just a one-to-one binding and there's no extra magic here, we still have actions and outlets. We just hide them from you. So for every view controller or UI table view controller, you're going to have a designer file. So you can see, in fact, I'll just do it here. You can see we've got the step counter controller.cs, and then directly underneath that is a nested class. We've got the designer file, which is auto-generated for you. And the guys have been pretty clear that you really shouldn't need to go in here and mess with this file. But it's always worth knowing that it exists. So when you're committing your Git, you don't just say, well, I don't need the designer file. You absolutely do need to be committing this. But here is how we deal with the madness of actions and outlets for you. So it's pretty nice. And then on the iOS app, I'll just show you again. We've also got things like share screens. So I can tap that, and I can go ahead, and I can tweet this. And again, this is 100% just the platform APIs. This isn't our version of what this should look like on iOS. I'm just calling into the same APIs that the Objective-C and Swift guys would be calling into. So I got the step counter app built in a morning, and you can kind of see that this is a morning's worth of programming. This isn't a huge amount of work to create this. Then everyone was happy. We got it in the App Store. And my colleague then went ahead and built the Android version. Now, the Android version is a bit different. So if we switch back over to here. So with Android, you have to have KitKat or above. And it's only going to work for some devices. It's not going to work with every single device. With iOS, I'm pretty confident, well, I know for sure, if you're running on an iPhone 5S or above, be it an iPad or whatever, this app will just work. Now, that hasn't stopped people from giving me 1 star in the App Store saying it don't work, when really they just didn't read the top line of the description, which clearly states requires an iPhone 5S or above. If you don't have a 5S or above, I show a very sad face. If anyone remembers Finder, the little icon, I've recreated Finder, but instead of a happy face, it's a sad face. And I say, hey, this device isn't supported. Terribly sorry. For Android, we have a similar thing. If the device isn't supported, we show a sad Finder face. Not sure why a Finder face on Android. But it uses a service. So with iOS, we can just ask the operating system, hey, I want to know how many steps I've taken from X. So be it yesterday or last week. With Android, there is no API to do this. With Android, we have to keep track of the steps ourselves. So James had to create a database in order to throw all of this information in, whereas with iOS, the database is managed for you. And this is just one example of many, many examples of how iOS is a much nicer developer experience versus Android. Now, I really like Android, especially with material design. It looks beautiful. But on average, an Android app will take you about 40 to 50% longer than the iOS equivalent. And this app is a pretty good app to show you just how more complex it is to develop an Android app versus iOS. So it uses a service, which I'll show you in a moment. But it's only had 1,000 to 5,000 downloads. And it's actually close to the 1,000 count. So those guys that are Android users, go and download it, please. And 5-star it. But don't download the version that someone reposted with the same icon and took our names out, because boo for them. So let's have a look at the code for this. So again, we're going to be in Xamarin Studio, which is entirely free. If there are any Mac users in the room, you probably will want to be using Xamarin Studio as your primary IDE if you're developing. Do you use Visual Studio still in a VM? Yeah. It's pretty nice. We just actually released on Tuesday. I forget what day it is because I lost a day flying. I'm very confused by that. But we released on Tuesday a whole new build agent which completely simplifies the way that you connect to the Mac. So it now uses SSH to tunnel in. So you only need the login credentials of the Mac rather than dealing with PIN numbers and firing up build hosts and things. It was pretty horrible before, but we've made it really nice. And what we've also done is that if you've got a team of 20 people working on an app, before you would have needed 20 versions of OS X running somewhere. Now what a lot of people did is they would have a Mac Mini as a server, and for everyone that wanted to connect, they would fire up a new VM of OS X and start the build host, and they would just connect to that. Or even worse, they would go out and buy 20 Macs, which the developers would literally get a Mac Mini. They'd be like, ugh, let's stick a Windows sticker over the Mac sticker and shove it in a bottom drawer on the network and never look at it again. Well, that's all changed with 4.0 of Xamarin. You can now have multiple connections to the same Mac, so you can have 20 developers all connect to the same Mac and all use storyboards and all do their builds without having this huge expenditure of having to go out and buy a huge amount of devices. So we're saving you money, which is lovely. But let's have a look at Android. So we'll just close all of this. Now, as I mentioned before, this works with a service. So with Android, we need to start the service somehow. So we're using this class in order to be notified of when the device starts. So when the device starts, we need to start this service, because I need to know once the device is on that I'm counting steps. Now with iOS, it's even nicer because the functionality for counting steps works even without power. So you can turn your phone off and it's still going to be counting your steps. Whereas with Android, you don't have that lovely feature. And the way Apple do that, in case you're wondering, is it's built into the CPU. So it's very, very clever. On Android, we don't have that, so we have to start this service. And let's actually go to the step service. And you can see here again, most of this code is unique to Android. I cannot share this with iOS. I can't share it with Windows Phone. So although we're still using C#, to define this as a cross-platform app right now is pretty difficult. But it's all C#, or we could have built this with F# as well. So we're going to say that when we start the application, or when we boot, we need to start this service. And this service is going to be the service that tracks how many steps we take and deals with throwing that into a database for us. And then when we actually launch our app, because the service and the app are separate entities in terms of Android, in fact, you can think of activities within Android as almost self-contained apps within themselves. So we start the service, and that's going to be responsible for counting all of our steps. And then when the user goes and hits our lovely step counter icon, we launch the UI, so we launch the main activity for our app, which looks very, very similar to the iOS UI. And then we start querying into this service. So James effectively had to recreate all of the lovely iOS APIs that I use for Android because he didn't have it himself. So let's have a quick look at this. You can see we've got this start command. So when we start, we need to start the service. So when we start the application, bum, 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 bum. We also need to display a warning to the user, say, hey, your device is not supported. You're going to need to go and buy a new device. And as I say, from the beginning, this was really important for Android because 99.99% of the devices that we were running this on didn't support it. And although we've got things like Test Cloud, it's exceptionally difficult to do a step counting test on a device that has only ever lived on a shelf because it would always return 0. So it's pretty difficult to test, so we literally just had to walk around. And then we deal with things like on destroy, so when we want to close the service, we're done. We need to clean up after ourselves. But most of the fun actually happens, when I say fun, use that how you will, within the activities. So again, the one-to-one mapping means that we can't share this code. This is a bit that the user is seeing. So this is a nice animation down, updating the labels, doing the share sheets and all of the Android-specific views. But you can see here that it's a lot more code than the iOS version. And that's why I say earlier on that with Android, you're going to be looking at about 40 to 50% increase in terms of developing the application. And that doesn't include things like testing. When you deal with testing for Android, you've got 17,000 different permeations of Android on different devices, which is pretty difficult to test for. And who here is testing on more than 127 devices? Just me? Okay, who here is testing on more than 50 devices? More than 25 devices? Come on, guys. More than 10 devices? Well, hey, more than 5 devices? More than 1 device? Why are there still people with hands down? That's slightly worrying. So if you're not testing more than 127 devices, you're not even reaching 75% of the market coverage for mobile devices in the US. So you're basically asking your users to test the app for you. So with Xamarin 4, we've just announced that everybody gets 1 hour a month of Test Cloud. So you should 100% be using that. Test Cloud is a warehouse in Denmark with 2,000 physical devices as they come from the manufacturer for you to upload your app onto. So we've not jailbroken, we've not installed custom ROMs, and we have multiple of the same devices with the same OS, and then we've got all the different permutations of the OSs as well, so that you can know exactly how your app is going to perform and look on all these different versions of Android. So that's pretty cool. But anyway, Android, much more difficult to develop for, much more difficult to test for. So I want to show you quickly, before we jump into the back end, the analytics. So we're going to show you insights. So I'm tracking some information about the iOS version with Xamarin Insights. And we're going to switch back now. Bum, bum, bum. So Xamarin Insights is pretty cool. It's our crash and analytics reporting tool. Is anyone using it today? Fantastic. So it's general availability with 4.0 of Xamarin. It's free to use for any Xamarin customer. You can pay as a standard .NET developer. I think it's $15 or $25, that's US dollars, a month. And with one line of code, we get all of this information. So let me show you. My step counter. I've had 2 crashes. Not ideal, but it's not terrible because actually the amount of users affected is 0.1% of users. And it turns out that crash is the same user. So I would hedge a bet that they've got some kind of dodgy device rather than it actually being a problem of mine, because it's only 0.1%. But we can come in and we can see information about the users. Now, with analytics, it's really important to only track the information that's actually important to you. Now, I can't think of a really good reason to know any information about someone walking around. I don't need to know their email address. I don't need to know their age or their name or anything. But I want to know about crashes, and I kind of want to know if people are actually using the app. So all I did was use one line of code to get Xamarin Insights started. which is xamarin.insights.initialize, and then I pass in my unique key. And that gives me all of this information. So I can see that guest 871, it's my favorite username, uses my step counter quite a lot. So he's had 12,000 sessions. I know no information about him, so I don't know any traits. But what I do know is how often he's using the app and what devices he's using it on. So he's got a 6 Plus. He's got a brand new device, which is pretty nice. But he's checking the app quite a lot. I mean, look at this. That's just in one day. And let's have a look at someone, less interested in their step count. Still a reasonable amount of checks every day that they're doing. But what I really love about Xamarin Insights is this audience tab. So the audience tab, and as I say, this is just one line of code which is giving me all of this information. In fact, I'll show you that one line of code. So we can come into our IDE. We will go into the app delegate, which on iOS is where we deal with the application lifecycle. So we're going to launch, we're going to close, and we're going into the background. Here we go, line 46. That one line of code gives me all of that data. It's pretty neat. I really like that. As I say, the crash reporting stuff is free to all Xamarin customers. But I can see how many active daily users have I got? Is it changing? If I release an update and all of my users disappear, I can rest assured that I've probably broken the app or people really don't like it anymore. I can see what versions of the app are they actually using. So this is really important with things like beer drinking, which we'll come on to, where the back end is going to change. If I want to make breaking changes, I can come in here and check that every user is running the latest version, so that I don't make changes to the back end that's going to break legacy versions of the application. You can see what OS version are they running. And then I can see what countries they're in as well. And what I really like is the top devices, which makes selecting the devices I want to test on within Xamarin Test Cloud even easier. What devices do I need to go out and buy? Which devices are my users actually using? So this is pretty neat. And this is all baked into the step counting application. So I built that app in basically an afternoon on Boxing Day. I got it into the App Store. My boss was like, fantastic, absolutely love it. And I was like, it didn't take very long. But he was still happy. Got 30,000 downloads on the App Store. And then almost 2 years later, Microsoft got in touch and they said, do you want to come to Australia and talk about my step counter? I was like, yeah, that sounds good. They're like, can you add Azure? We want to be able to track how many steps people are taking. I was like, that sounds pretty easy. Let's make that happen. Now, I love Azure. Is anyone using Azure? So if you need to do cloud and you're a .NET developer, it is phenomenal. There's something very, very, very nice about being able to attach a debugger to a server where you don't even know where the server is, but your debugger is attached. Amazing. So they came to me and they're like, we want you to add Azure to step counter. So they had some criteria for what it needed to do. Naturally, it was going to be a mobile service, so Azure Mobile Service. Wasn't going to use app service just yet because it's still in preview. It's not out of preview yet. I like to use stable software rather than the cutting edge. I wanted to build it entirely in C#, naturally, because I'm a C# developer. And we wanted to do Facebook Social War. So we needed to be able to authenticate the user. But with Azure, you may know that if you authenticate the user using the beautiful API that Microsoft give you on the client side, which is just one line of code, and it brings up the web view for you, and it deals with all the authentication, it's really, really nice, you only get an ID that is unique to that user within Azure. It's not actually going to give you any information about them as a user from Facebook. So you're not going to get their name, you're not going to get their email address, you're not going to get their age or any other information other than this GUID, which isn't that helpful. So let's fire up Visual Studio and look at how I solved that. Let's zoom in here. Is that big enough for everyone? Yeah? Perfect. So here's my Azure project, my mobile service, which is just basically a default mobile service. When you create the project or the solution, you get the to-do list mobile service, which gets you most of the way there for what this kind of app's doing. You know, we're going to throw some data up into Azure. We're going to throw it into a database. And we also wanted to add user functionality. So with the user functionality, I wanted to be able to get that extra information. So I've come into Web API config, and I'm going to remove the default implementation of the Facebook login provider. And the reason I do that is because the default implementation only gives me that GUID, which is no use to me in order to get more information about the user. So I've actually inherited from Facebook login provider, and I created my own custom Facebook login provider. So I then need to go and add that as a config option. So let's have a look at the code for that. We'll close this down. It's pretty simple. We've got this create credentials, which is going to be called when the user successfully authenticates. So, you know, they've authenticated, they're good to go. And we can add some extra code in here. So I grabbed a Facebook package off NuGet. Love NuGet. It makes my life a million times easier as a developer. And I get the access token from the credential, from the claims identity that are passed in. So I've got the Facebook token, so I can then go ahead and query more information using the Open Graph Facebook API about the user, which I can then add into my user object. So that's exactly what I do. So you can see here, if the claim is the email address, I'm going to set email address to be the claim.value. We want that to be a string, naturally. But then I go ahead and create the user. So we've got the user ID, which is their Facebook GUID. We then get their email address, their first name, their last name, their gender, and their date of birth. And we put this all within a table. And then any step counts that occur on iOS or Android are linked to the user so that we can go in and see individual people. So we can look at your email address and we can say, you know, you've taken 10,000 steps today, or you've taken 5,000. You're 50% of the way there. So this is pretty nice, but this is code that I literally copied and pasted from the beer drinking application that I wrote. Now the beer drinking application also has Google authentication, which does exactly the same thing. I had to inherit from the Google login provider and then go ahead and fetch more information that I wanted to throw into my table. So in terms of things like throwing data into my SQL database within Azure, it's just the simple controllers that we know from Web API. So if you've ever built an MVC app and used Web API, you're going to feel right at home with Azure. Super, super simple. As I say, this is by far my favorite cloud provider. And as a developer evangelist at Xamarin, I am forced to try them all. But whenever it comes to developing, you know, a back-end solution, this is my go-to. It is absolutely amazing. And then we've got things like our step entry, and we're going to save the user ID, we want the steps, and then we want the date time of when that was. Because with iOS, we're just going to be throwing that up every time the event raises. So the event comes in that we've taken another 10 steps. I throw it up into the cloud that they've taken an extra 10 steps. So this is where it starts to become cross-platform. I created this API client. And you can see it's 104 lines, but there's some white space in there as well. But the method that's important is save step entry async. And I'm literally just taking the step count and I'm throwing that into Azure. Now this is a cross-platform code with my step counter. This is the bit that we can share across any platform, be it Windows Phone, UWP, Xbox, although your Xbox isn't going to be doing step counting, but this code will still run there. So it's pretty neat. So we threw that into the step counting application. We republished it to the App Store. I see you're taking photos. If you want the code, it's all on my GitHub, and I will show you where you can find it later. As I said, with the beer drinking application, where a lot of this code has come from, I actually went ahead and published all of the keys as well. So you can literally just clone the repository, and you're good to go. You don't have to go ahead and deploy your own Azure instance. You can just use the one I've built for you. Because I want it to be as easy as possible for you guys to be able to get started and potentially help build the application. Boom, boom, boom. So I'm going to switch back here. I'm going to say you can find me on GitHub, which is where you can find the code, at mikecodes.net. And the step counting application is on there, as is beer drinking, which, as I say, is iOS at the moment only. I've got a friend building the Android version as I build the iOS version. And then we're going to do UWP, because I'm super excited about saying, hey, Cortana, add Stella Artois to my beer library. And for her to go, OK, Mike, and go ahead and search the database, find the Stella Artois, and add it as an item. Super excited about that. There's some really nice new APIs in Windows 10 that I 100% want to take advantage of. So I'm going to show you a slightly more exciting, whilst we have time, and it's not a huge amount of time, but a more exciting application, which is the beer drinking application. So allow me to fire up this iOS simulator. I'm going to switch back. So here we go. This is all open source. It's entirely C#. It's that native approach. I'm not sure if any of you have used Xamarin Forms, but this is not a Xamarin Forms application. Now, when you look at it in this state, I absolutely could have used Xamarin Forms, but my long-term aim for this is to try and get a design award from Apple. So I wanted to be able to use every single API that the Objective-C and Swift guys are using in order to hit that goal. But let's authenticate with Facebook. So we're going to sign in. And on my back end, it's going to go ahead and do all of that, getting the token, finding my email address, finding my name, and throw it into the table if it's not already there, but it is already there. Boom, there we go. And I've got offline sync as well. So this is the reason I built this application. Because with Azure, we can do offline sync with just a couple of lines of code. Now, the Cordova app that I'm trying to wipe off the face of the earth, because it's horrible, they can't do offline. So when I go to my favorite pub that has no signal and no Wi-Fi, and I'm like, I want to search for a beer. I've had this beer before, but I want to search for it and add it to my library. I just can't do it, because it's just a web app. It needs the internet there. Whereas with Azure and offline sync, I've got all of that data no matter if I'm connected or not, which is super nice. And I've got some caching in there as well. So any beers that you search for, I'm going to cache on your device for 30 days. So even if you've not added it to your library, if you come in here and search for Castile Donker, which is another one of my favorite beers that I've not had in a while, I searched for it, I've read about it, I can come in here and it will just pull up the cached version instead. So we will, in fact, search for Duvel. Has anyone had a Duvel? Perfect. So Duvel is Flemish, so basically Dutch, for devil. So it's a pretty strong beer. Let's have a look. We'll go for the single. You can see I've not consumed any of them just yet, because it is a strong beer, but it's 8.5%. And then we pull in some information about the beer from our database. And I've got things like barcode support. So when I deploy on a device that has a camera, such as your iPhone or your iPod, if you've got a can of beer, you don't want to have to be searching for it like an animal writing text in. You just want to search for the barcode. But the database that I use, BreweryDB, has no concept of barcodes. It doesn't have the UPC. So what I do is when you hit the barcode button and I bring up the barcode scanner, we scan the barcode, and I go off and search another API. So I use RateBeer, which does have UPCs. And then I fetch the name of the beer, so Duvel, and then I search within my database for that beer. And once you add the beer with that UPC, for anybody else that searches for it, it's now in my database, and I'll return back the proper beer first time so we don't have to go through the step. So it's pretty nice. We can go ahead and search the beers, add a rating, and then we've got a user, and we can see all the photos that we've taken in here as well. So it's a pretty interesting little app. And I also do things like tracking your location. So if you're using this on the device, I can show you a map of everywhere and at what time you had those beers. Now the plan is on the back end in Azure to tie that up with machine learning to say things like, well, it's 30 degrees outside today. Mike James historically likes to drink lagers. Why don't we suggest to him some lagers in the current area that he's in that he might like? Because it's pretty hard to find the lagers that I drink at home in Australia. So machine learning can make those suggestions to me. And I can do that all because I'm using Azure. So let's fire up the back end and have a look at how some of this works. And as I say, this is all on GitHub. This is all ready to go. You can just go to my GitHub, mikecos.net, clone, you're good to go. You don't need to do anything else. Preparing a solution. It's a big solution. Here we go. You can see I've got a lot of controllers. I've got a fair amount of models as well and data objects. But the thing that most people do is they search for beers. So within the search beer controller, I'm using a library that I wrote, which again is on my GitHub, so you can go and grab it. And I actually published a NuGet whilst I was in San Francisco of this as well. So if you search for BreweryDB on NuGet, you will find my NuGet package. So I can stop referencing this like an animal and just use the NuGet package instead. But I use my BreweryDB client to go off and fetch the information about the beer. If I've already got the beer in the database, I don't need to save it again. But if it's a new beer I've never seen before, I'm going to throw it in my database. And the reason for this is BreweryDB is curated. So any edits that we make to that data and we send back to them, a human actually goes and looks at it and confirms that that's correct data, which is a pretty slow turnaround. So I didn't want my users to have to deal with that. I want that when they edit the beer, we just take that as gospel. We know that that's the correct information because I trust you guys. So I'm going to save that in my database rather than sending it straight back up to BreweryDB. But this same BreweryDB library is working on iPhone and Android as it is in Azure. So when I do the standard Xamarin Forms introduction talk, we'll normally build the application using iOS traditional APIs, grab this NuGet package, we'll go and search the information, and the same code will run on the mobile device. We add it to a list view, and then we build the same app in Xamarin Forms. So the same library, the same BreweryDB library is running on iOS, Android, and then I went and took it and ran it in the cloud. So that's a really, really nice thing about Azure, is that all this existing code that I've already written for mobile or desktop, 9 times out of 10, I can go ahead and run it in the cloud as well. But there's nothing to be scared of with this project. It is actually pretty simple. But as I say, it's for iOS at the moment only. I've got a friend working on the Android version. It will be coming to UWP. If anyone wants to help with the UWP version, I'm more than happy to accept pull requests. I'm also in a fortunate position that I can give Xamarin licenses away to people that help out on open source projects like this. So if anyone's sat here thinking, I really, really want a Xamarin license for free, you know what to do. So just quickly, I want to talk about Xamarin 4 before we end, and then I'll take some questions. Xamarin 4 is what we announced on Tuesday or Wednesday your time, maybe, yeah? Super confusing. I boarded a plane on Sunday and didn't land till Tuesday. That makes no sense to me. But anyway, so Xamarin Forms is what we announced on Wednesday, which is an update to all of our tools. So it's an update across everything. There's nothing super new. We've not got any fantastic new products to show. It was mainly just about making the experiences that we already have a little bit nicer. So in terms of the build, we completely re-architected the way that our iOS designer and Android designer work, both within Visual Studio and Xamarin Studio. This is a real pain point for a lot of developers with the old version, and this is hugely, hugely improved. Things just like the speed at which the storyboards render on the screen. And the storyboard rendering is an interesting one because we're actually instantiating multiple versions of the iOS simulator, which is how we do the live rendering of custom controls, because you're literally designing on the iOS simulator, which is pretty nice. But we sped up the whole process. It's much more streamlined. We've added new features to Xamarin Test Cloud, such as the test recorder. So historically, you would write your tests using Calabash. Has anyone written anything in Calabash? Awesome. Or UI test. Has anyone used UI test? A couple of you. So you would literally write your test scripts, So now I'm on the home screen. I see that Facebook Connect button. Let's tap that Facebook Connect button. And then I expect it for the authentication view to come up. And now I'm going to look for the text field of username and so on. And you write all of your test scripts like that. And you can use a REPL, but you're still going to be writing some C# to get there. So what we did is we created the UI test recorder, which allows you to fire up the simulator or the device, and then you just start using it how a user would use it, and it's going to generate the UI test code for you, so you don't have to sit there like an animal and write it out by scratch. What I will say is with that approach is that you're going to want to go in and edit it afterwards just to clean it up, because it's not going to be the best UI test that you've ever written, but it's going to get you 90–95% of the way there. And then you're ready to upload to Test Cloud. And as I say, every Xamarin subscriber gets 60 minutes a month. So if you integrate Test Cloud insights, you know what devices your users are running on. You can use that 60 minutes to find the crash, find what device it was on, test it in Test Cloud, saving yourself some money and some time rather than going out to the Apple Store or to the Samsung Store and buying the devices. We then did the general release of Xamarin Insights, as I say, completely free to Xamarin subscribers. It is just that one line of code to get started. It's a no-brainer. If you're a Xamarin subscriber, just go ahead and grab the NuGet package. One line of code. Any uncaught exceptions will be caught. We rethrow them naturally, but we catch them and we report them into the dashboard as you've seen. And we can give you steps that the user took to get to that crash, so you can very quickly recreate the steps required to make your app crash as a user did. And then we have Accelerate, which is a team of extraordinarily talented engineers that are on hand to help you build your applications. So we call it the Jetpacks team. They're insanely intelligent. So the lead guy for the Jetpacks team, James Clancy, he built the UI test recorder proof of concept in no more than a few days. If you've seen the Xamarin Inspector, that was just a couple of days' work to get the proof of concept working. They're very, very talented engineers. And they're on hand. You can pay for them for an hourly rate, or you can even have them fly over and spend a week with you to get you started or fix problems within your applications and talk general architecture. So it's really great if you've got a really high-risk project, or you need some help, or you've got a bug that you just can't fix, or in your application rather than within Xamarin, they're great to go to. So as I say, what's new? UI test recorder. We rebuilt the iOS designer. Xamarin Insights, Xamarin Inspector, which is pretty awesome, but only in preview at the moment. And then if anyone's used CocoaPods, which is like NuGet for Objective-C and C#, we now support CocoaPods within Objective-Sharpie. Now, Objective-Sharpie is a tool that we use to create those bindings, that one-to-one binding within iOS. So you can literally go into Terminal and you can say, hey, Objective-Sharpie, or Sharpie, I want to go and find this CocoaPod, and it's going to download it. It's going to build a universal binary for you. So that's a binary that's going to run on the simulator and 32-bit and 64-bit devices. So you don't have to go into Xcode and mess around with build settings. It's just going to do it for you. So it builds a library for you, and then it's going to generate the C# binding. Now, C# binding is basically p-invoking into the native library. So it generates that all for you. And as I say, this is the same tool that we use internally. So when Apple come out with iOS 10, we will be using Objective-Sharpie to do that binding for us. Now, we do have a human go through and actually confirm that the bindings are correct, but it's exactly the same tools that we use, that we ship to you. So if you see a control on CocoaPods or on GitHub that's in Swift or Objective-C and you're like, I really want to use that in Xamarin, Objective-Sharpie, you're good to go. So thank you very much. I apologize that it's been a bit of a strange session today. As I say, it's It's a little bit last minute for me to come and do this. I spent most of last week in San Francisco trying to sort out the Microsoft Connect demo for New York. So this hasn't been the most prepared session I've ever done in my life. But I'm happy to take questions, and thank you so much for coming along. So are there any questions? Xamarin Forms designer. It's always a question. So who here is using Xamarin Forms? Cool. So for those of you who are not, it's our abstraction above the platform APIs. So we found stuff that was common, buttons, list views, all of that stuff. It's all on every single platform, but the APIs we use is very different. So that's what Xamarin Forms is. In terms of the UI designer, incredibly hard problem to solve. So the iOS designer that you're seeing, in order to go from proof of concept to a release that we could preview to customers was 2 years. It's a very, very hard problem to solve just for one platform. To hit all 3 platforms is even more difficult. Now, what I will say is I'm not allowed to stand here and say yes or no. Well, I could say no, but I don't like to say no. Find a silver lining. What I will say is that we heard for a long time that people didn't like using Xcode to design their UIs for Xamarin iOS. We listened. And now we have the UI designer for Xamarin iOS in Xamarin Studio and in Visual Studio. So we hear you. That's all I can say. Any other questions?
When you open your developer app in the Visual Studio, I see the folder for iOS, but I don't see the folder for Android.
That's because in the Visual Studio project, I actually did the Android version on the Mac rather than within Visual Studio. Oh, 100%. So actually, if I open the project on what you saw within Xamarin Studio, you saw the Android version. It's just I load up a different solution because the solution can't bring in the Azure service within Xamarin Studio. I need Visual Studio for that. So I always create 2 solutions. I have a Xamarin Studio solution, which is just mobile and just shared code. And then I have a Visual Studio solution, which normally has everything. But if I don't get round to doing any Android development within Visual Studio, I just don't add the project. There's another question over here.
We looked at it about a year and a half ago, and the cost was phenomenal at the time. It was $1,000 just to, after 30 days, to pay for a trial license, I think it was.
So the trial is 90 days for an MSDN subscriber. Are you an MSDN?
It's universal, but at the time, this a year and a half ago,
yeah.
they wanted another $999, whatever it was, to extend it. And we thought it was just ridiculous to pay that amount just for something that we may or may not use.
Yeah. So I hear you. I hear you. So I'm at liberty to extend trials at will. So you should just email me if you want to retry Xamarin. I'll give you the 90 days, and if you hit 90 days and you're like, we're still not sure, I'll just give you another 90 days. It's no water off my back. I don't work on commission. I'm not a sales guy. But in terms of our pricing, you're right. It is still $1,000 per platform per developer for Visual Studio support, which to some businesses can seem a bit steep. But I think when you factor in the productivity gains that you get, in terms of you're already a .NET house, right? You've already got C# developers that are skilled in Visual Studio. They're very, very proficient within that IDE. If you want to go mobile, you've got a couple of options. You can reuse their existing skill set and just kind of take on that as just an added extra. When you think of the size of their salary, it's not a huge amount extra. Or you can say to them, guys, we're going to need you to learn Swift, Objective-C, and Java, or we want to go hybrid, and then your users will probably hate you for it. So the pricing is a difficult conversation for me to have because I'm not a sales guy, and I try to minimize my time around them because I don't like giving sales responses. But what I will say, if it is a huge expense to you, realize that they work on commission. They're always happy to make a sale and always happy to knock the price down. And if you're looking to have more than 5 engineers working on the project, they can give you something called Ultimate, where they give you Xamarin University to get your engineers trained up within Xamarin and mobile in general. You get all the licenses that you need for that year. So in year 1, you've got 5 developers. You get about 40% discount, and that includes Insights and Test Cloud and all of our product offering at 40% off. If you then 10 days into the project, you say, we're going to need more developers. You don't have to pay any extra until the end of the year. So at the end of the year, we then go ahead and we look at how many seats you've activated. So you may add another 5 developers to hit your deadline. And then we renegotiate another year's subscription, again with a heavy discount. As I say, the sales team are always super happy to make a sale. Don't just take the first price that they give you. But as I say, I'm not a sales guy, so it's a pretty difficult conversation for me to have. Were there any other questions? Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.